Starcom. The U.S. Space Force was one of the most technologically advanced toy lines of the 1980s, and it died before most of you even knew it existed. Now I know what you're thinking. Another forgotten 80s toy line, right? But here's the thing. Starcom wasn't just another cheap plastic cash grab riding the coattails of Star Wars. This was Coleco, the same company that brought you the Cabbage Patch Kids craze, pouring serious engineering into a toy line that featured actual working magnetic technology and motorized deployment systems. We're talking about toys that were legitimately innovative, not just repaints of the same mold. But here's what makes this story fascinating. While Starcom flopped hard in the United States and helped push Coleco into bankruptcy, it became a massive hit internationally. And get this, the animated series that was supposed to sell the toys? Most of the episodes never even aired in America. So in this video, I'm going to walk you through the complete story of Starcom, from its cutting-edge Magnalock technology that actually worked, to the Shadow Force villains you never got to see. And I'll show you exactly why this brilliant toy line crashed and burned in the US market while becoming a cult classic everywhere else. But first, let me give you some context on just how ambitious this whole thing was. Because when you see what Coleco was trying to pull off in 1987, you'll understand why this deserves to be remembered. The engineering marvel, Magna Lock and Power Deploy. Alright, so let's talk about what made Starcom special, because this is where things get really interesting. Picture this, it's 1987, and every toy company is trying to figure out how to make their action figures stick to vehicles without using those annoying little pegs that always broke off. You remember those, right? You'd lose the peg, and suddenly your G.I. Joe was just sliding around in his vehicle, like he was driving on ice. Coleco's solution? Magnets. But not just any magnets. They called it Magna Lock. And it was genuinely clever. They embedded magnets in the feet of the figures and in the vehicles, so your astronauts would actually lock into place with a satisfying click. No pegs, no clips, just pure magnetic attraction. And here's the kicker. It actually worked. These figures stayed put. But Coleco didn't stop there. They also developed something called Power Deploy, which was basically motorized transformation for the vehicles. You'd press a button and panels would open, ramps would extend, weapons would pop out, all powered by a little motor inside. This was Tomee's influence, by the way. Tomee was Coleco's partner on this project, and they brought their expertise in motorized toys to the table. Now, here's where it gets technical, and this is important because it explains a lot about what went wrong later. The Magna Lock system used these small, powerful magnets that had to be precisely positioned. The power deploy mechanisms required gears, motors, and moving parts that had to be manufactured to pretty tight tolerances. This wasn't cheap plastic you could bang out in a factory for pennies. This was actual engineering. And you could feel it when you held these toys. The vehicles had weight to them. The Starmax Bomber, the Shadow Parasite, the Star Wolf. These weren't hollow shells. They felt substantial, like real machines. The figures themselves were small, only about 2 inches tall, but they were detailed and well articulated for their size. The problem? All this innovation came at a cost. These toys were expensive to manufacture, and that meant they were expensive at retail. And in 1987, when you're competing with established lines, like G.I. Joe and Transformers, that parents already knew and trusted, being the expensive new kid on the block was a tough sell. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's talk about the story behind these toys. Because Coleco didn't just make vehicles and figures. They built an entire universe. The animated series, a cinematic vision. So here's where things get really frustrating, because Starcom actually had a pretty solid animated series to back it up. We're talking 13 episodes produced to support the toy line, which was standard practice back then. You had your heroes, your villains, your ongoing conflict, all the ingredients for a successful franchise. The setup was actually pretty cool. You've got Starcom, the United States Space Force, which is basically an interplanetary peacekeeping organization. They're the good guys, exploring space, protecting Earth, doing all that heroic stuff. And opposing them is the Shadow Force, led by this guy, Emperor Dark. Now, Emperor Dark isn't just some generic bad guy. He's the leader of the Shadow Force Starmada, and he's got this whole crew of villains working for him. You've got General Torvek, who's the military commander, Admiral Khan, who runs the fleet, Brigadier Krell, Colonel Toth, Captain Shrike. They built out this whole hierarchy of bad guys, each with their own personality and role. The conflict between Starcom and Shadow Force wasn't just good guys versus bad guys. The episodes dealt with actual strategic missions, tactical engagements, space warfare. This wasn't Saturday morning cartoon fluff. They were trying to tell real science fiction stories. And here's the thing that'll blow your mind. Most Americans never saw these episodes. That's right. The series aired, but it had terrible distribution in the United States. The episodes that did air were scattered across different markets, different time slots, and a lot of them just didn't air at all. There are episodes that were produced, completed, and ready to go that American audiences never got to see during the original run. But internationally, different story. The show aired more completely in other markets, which helped build awareness for the toy line overseas. In some countries, they even rebranded the whole thing with different names to better fit local markets. This distribution problem was a massive issue for Coleco, because the whole point of the cartoon was to sell toys. That's how it worked in the 80s. The cartoon was basically a 22-minute commercial. But if kids aren't seeing the cartoon, they don't know the characters, they don't know the vehicles, and they don't ask their parents to buy the toys. And speaking of those characters, let me tell you about some of the episodes that actually did air, because they show what this series could have been. The episodes that did make it to air covered some pretty ambitious ground. We're talking about missions to different planets, encounters with alien technology, battles in asteroid fields, real space opera stuff. But here's what's fascinating. There's this whole layer of lost Starcom content that most people don't know about. We're talking about unaired episodes, scripts that were written but never produced, and even literary references hidden in the show that only hardcore fans would catch. The writers actually put some thought into this universe. They weren't just cranking out generic toy commercials. There were callbacks to earlier episodes, character development, ongoing plot threads. They were trying to build something that would last. And then there are the episodes that exist, but were never widely seen. These are the holy grail for Starcom collectors today. Recordings of episodes that aired once, maybe twice, in obscure markets, and then vanished. Some of these have surfaced over the years through collector networks, but others are still lost. There's also evidence of scripts that were written, but never produced. The series was clearly planned for more than 13 episodes, but production stopped. Whether this was due to budget issues, Coleco's financial problems, or poor ratings, we don't know for sure, but there was definitely more story they wanted to tell. This is one of the tragedies of Starcom. It was a franchise that never got to fully realize its potential. The toys were innovative, the show was decent, but the execution of the launch was botched so badly that it never had a chance to find its audience in the US. The market failure and Coleco's collapse. Alright, so let's talk about why this all fell apart, because this is where the story gets really interesting from a business perspective. Starcom launched in 1987, which was actually a terrible time to launch a new toy line. The market was saturated. You had G.I. Joe at its peak. Transformers was still going strong. Masters of the Universe was everywhere. And these weren't just toy lines. They were cultural phenomena with massive marketing budgets and established fan bases. Coleco was trying to break into this crowded market with a premium-priced product that required explanation. Remember, the Magna Lock and power deploy features were cool, but they weren't immediately obvious from looking at the package. You had to get the toy in your hands to appreciate what made it special. And here's the brutal truth. Coleco's promotional efforts were inadequate. They didn't have the marketing muscle to compete with Hasbro and Mattel. The TV spots were limited. The cartoon had poor distribution, as we've discussed, and retail placement was inconsistent. Some stores carried the line, others didn't. But the real killer was market saturation. Parents were already buying G.I. Joe and Transformers. Kids already had their favorite characters and vehicles. Convincing them to switch to a new, more expensive line that they'd never heard of, that's a tough sell. And then there's the timing issue. Coleco was already in financial trouble by 1987. The Cabbage Patch Kids craze had peaked and was declining. The company had made some bad bets on other products. They were bleeding money, and Starcom was supposed to be their next big hit. It wasn't. The line struggled at retail. Sales were disappointing, and by 1988, Coleco was in serious trouble. They filed for bankruptcy, and Starcom was one of the casualties. But here's where the story takes a weird turn. Mattel acquired the Starcom assets from Coleco's bankruptcy, and internationally, the line actually did pretty well. So while Starcom was dying in America, it was actually finding an audience overseas. And this is one of the most interesting aspects of the whole story. Different countries rebranded the line with different names to better fit their markets. The toys were the same, but the packaging and marketing were localized. And in some markets, the distribution of the cartoon was much better, which helped drive toy sales. Mattel, after acquiring the line, focused on these international markets. They continued to produce Starcom toys for foreign distribution, even after the line had been discontinued in the United States. This is why you'll find Starcom toys with different packaging and different names if you're hunting through international collector markets today. The European market in particular embraced Starcom. The toys were available there longer, and there's a stronger collector community for the line in Europe than in the US. Same thing in parts of Asia and South America. This international success is why Starcom has this weird legacy. In America, it's this obscure footnote in 80s toy history that most people have never heard of. But internationally, especially among collectors, it's a respected line with a dedicated following. The technical failures and production issues. Now we need to talk about something that doesn't get discussed enough. The toys themselves had problems. Remember all that innovative engineering I praised earlier? Well, it came with a downside. The power deploy mechanisms were fragile. Those little motors and gears, they broke. A lot. If you're a collector trying to find vintage Starcom toys today, one of the biggest challenges is finding vehicles with working power deploy features. The mechanisms failed over time, or they broke during play. Kids were rough with their toys. That's what kids do. And these delicate motorized systems couldn't take the abuse. The Magna lock system was more reliable, but even that had issues. The magnets could lose their strength over time. And if a figure or vehicle got damaged and the magnet came loose, good luck fixing it without completely disassembling the toy. There were also quality control issues during production. Some toys had misaligned parts, weak motors, or magnets that weren't properly secured. This wasn't universal. Plenty of Starcom toys were well made, but the inconsistency was a problem. And here's the thing. When you're charging premium prices for toys, they need to be bulletproof. Parents expect quality. Kids expect durability. And Starcom, for all its innovation, didn't always deliver on that front. This is one of the reasons the line struggled. Word gets around. If kids are telling their friends that their Starcom toys broke, or if parents are returning defective products to stores, that kills momentum fast. Coleco was aware of these issues, and there's evidence they were working to address them in later production runs. But by then, it was too late. The damage to the brand's reputation was done, and the company was out of money. The legacy and the modern connection. So here's where we get to the really wild part of this story. Starcom, the US Space Force, was a toy line from 1987, and in 2019, the United States government created an actual military branch called the United States Space Force. Now, is there a direct connection? No. Did someone in the Pentagon remember their Starcom toys from childhood and decide to name the new military branch after them? Almost certainly not. But the coincidence is absolutely wild. For decades, Starcom was this obscure 80s toy line that nobody remembered. And then suddenly, the name is back in the news because it's now the official name of America's space military operations. This has led to a minor resurgence of interest in the original toy line. Collectors have noticed increased prices for vintage Starcom toys. There have been articles written about the connection, and there's been speculation about whether Mattel, which still owns the rights to the Starcom brand, might try to revive the line. So far, that hasn't happened. But the fact that Space Force is now part of the American cultural conversation has given Starcom a second life in the collector community. And really, that's the perfect encapsulation of Starcom's legacy. It was a toy line that was ahead of its time, poorly marketed, and killed by corporate bankruptcy. But it was innovative enough and interesting enough that it's never been completely forgotten. There's a dedicated community of collectors who hunt for these toys, who preserve the history, and who keep the memory of Starcom alive. The toys show up at conventions. They're traded in online forums. And every once in a while, a prototype or unreleased item surfaces and causes a stir in the collector world. So that's the complete story of Starcom, the US Space Force. A toy line that featured genuinely innovative technology, backed by a decent animated series, launched at the worst possible time into an oversaturated market by a company that was already circling the drain. It failed in America, but succeeded internationally. It was killed by bankruptcy before it could reach its full potential. And decades later, its name was inadvertently revived by the US government, creating an actual Space Force. The tragedy of Starcom is that it deserved better. The engineering was solid. The designs were cool. The universe they built had potential. But in the brutal world of 1980s, toy marketing, innovation wasn't enough. You needed distribution, marketing muscle, and timing. Starcom had none of those things. But here's what I find fascinating. Despite all of this, despite being a commercial failure, despite most of the episodes never airing, despite the line being canceled after barely a year, Starcom is still remembered. There are still collectors who treasure these toys. There are still fans who wish they could see those unaired episodes. That's the mark of something special. That's the mark of a franchise that, in another timeline, could have been huge. And who knows, maybe someday, with the actual US Space Force now being a real thing, someone will decide to revive Starcom. Maybe someone will track down those lost episodes. Until then, Starcom remains one of the great what-if stories of 80s toy history. A brilliant idea, poorly executed, that deserved so much better than it got. Thanks for watching, everyone. But here's the thing. Starcom wasn't the only innovative toy line that crashed and burned in the 80s. The decade is littered with forgotten franchises that tried to compete with the big boys and failed. So if you want to see more stories like this, check out my video on Challenge of the GoBots, where I break down another forgotten toy line that deserved better. Trust me, you'll want to see this one.